A failure that should not have happened. That's what the Justice Department is saying about the police response to the 2022 Uvalde school shooting, which killed 19 children and 2 teachers. The White House today calling for more gun control. Joining us now live is NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao. Good evening, Iris. So what is the new report telling us about what exactly happened that day?
Good evening to you, Steve. In a nearly 600-page report released on Thursday, the Justice Department concludes that critical failures in both in tactics and leadership were to blame for why police officers waited for over an hour before confronting a gunman at a shooting at a Uvalde elementary school about 2 years ago, which, like you said, killed 21 people. Attorney General Merrick Garland saying this after meeting with some of the families of the victims. Watch.
Failures in leadership, in tactics, in communications, in training, and in preparedness were made by law enforcement leaders and others. I also told the families and survivors how deeply sorry I am for the losses they suffered that day and for the losses they have suffered every day since.
The single most critical and tactical failure, the report says, was a decision made by local police officers to classify this incident on the scene as a barricaded standoff instead of an active shooter scenario, which would have made them actually go straight in and take down the shooter immediately. And another critical failure was a lack of a clear leadership, according to the report. Some police officers were actually confused about who was actually in charge. Meanwhile, some families of the victims saying this after meeting with AG Garland and saying they want accountability and changes. Watch.
I guess the next step is to find out what will be done with this information.
Hopefully that this will bring some changes and some accountability that we have been fighting and asking for since the very beginning.
Meanwhile, President Biden today again calling for stricter gun control. He wrote on a Thursday statement that, quote, "We must ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. The families of Uvalde deserve nothing less." Back to you.
NTD's Iris Tao with a live report from the White House. Thank you, Iris. Years after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, questions surrounding its origins and the government's response continue to linger. For instance, did the virus leak from a lab in Wuhan, China? And were the nationwide lockdowns, social distancing requirements, and mask mandates actually based on science? Last week, Dr. Anthony Fauci provided 14 hours of testimony to the Select Subcommittee on the coronavirus pandemic behind closed doors. Some of what he said, according to lawmakers, was quite revealing. And according to a statement from the subcommittee, Fauci said that social distancing guidance from federal health officials likely had no scientific basis and that the policy, quote, sort of just appeared. On the topic of the COVID vaccine, Fauci reportedly admitted the vaccine mandates could prompt more vaccine hesitancy in the future. He also acknowledged that the lab leak hypothesis was not a conspiracy theory. According to the subcommittee statement, Congressman Brad Wenstrup, chairman of the House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic, said Fauci didn't recall important information related to COVID-19 over 100 times, including conversations he had about its origins. And we have now more information about the timeline of the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak. Lawmakers have been releasing documents showing that the genetic sequence of the CCP virus was submitted to an NIH database 2 weeks before the Chinese regime officially disclosed it. To find out more about the Chinese regime's role in the early stages of the pandemic, we had a chance to sit down with Senator Roger Marshall. The senator is also a physician himself. Senator Roger Marshall, thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here. Always glad to share our story a little bit.
Absolutely, Senator. How do you think that the CCP's handling of COVID-19, specifically the information that they had before anybody else knew it, has impacted global security, both in the health field and beyond?
You know, it's a long story to try to condense it all in just a matter of a couple of seconds. But let me just start by saying that there is a huge body of evidence out there that if I could get in front of a jury, that they would find the Chinese Communist Party, guilty of leaking this virus from a laboratory out of Wuhan, China. A huge body of evidence out there. And I think we're, even this last couple of weeks, new evidence coming forth that Dr. Ren, who worked for the Chinese Communist Party as a pathologist, actually sent to our own NIH lab bank the COVID DNA sequence 2 weeks before someone else who was brave enough to do that. But the NIH was stupid enough to delete it. So we could have started on that vaccination process 2 weeks earlier at a minimum. But the fact that they hid what was going on there, that they continued to say over and over again that this was not transmitted person to person, it kept us from responding in the fashion we could have. We actually taught them how to do this. By the way, even Dr. Ren was working for EcoHealth, funded through the NIH. So when they're continuing this type of research, it definitely affects our national security. Even again, last week we found out that they're working on a COVID virus that impacts the brain rather than the lungs. So I just don't see the benefit in doing that. So they're probably using American dollars to do research, continue this viral gain of function research. That's why we've asked for a moratorium on any type of research like this.
To your point, even former NIH Director Francis Collins, Dr. Fauci, as recently as this week, saying that the idea of COVID being leaked from a lab is not a conspiracy theory anymore.
Right. You know, it's just amazing me. Here we are. Goodness, it's 2024. It's 4 years after this happened. And the things that I was being censored for, being taken offline as a physician myself, for being criticized because I didn't agree with Dr. Fauci. And now Dr. Fauci really putting some cards on the table, Dr. Collins as well, saying, you know, well, maybe it did come from a laboratory. Certainly all the evidence, this huge body of evidence says it came from a laboratory. They still haven't found an animal source from it. Here we are again, 4 years later, no animal source. It was a perfect virus. And by the way, the Chinese Communist Party has killed all the witnesses. So many of the witnesses that wanted to share information have just mysteriously died. Even the person that was doing the vaccine research and probably where it was leaked from, that person has died as well. They've taken down all the DNA sequences from our laboratory banks as well as their own laboratory banks. They could easily disprove our theory if they would just go into their own lab bank and show us the cousin or the brother of this virus, but they're not willing to do that.
Senator, what steps can be taken to prevent future situations from unfolding the way that this obviously has?
You know, I think number one is we have to have a moratorium on gain of function research. I don't see the benefits outweigh the risk at this point in time. So we need a complete moratorium and certainly need to stop helping our enemies out. You know, my concern going forward is what Americans don't understand is the scientific community in China works hand in hand with the Chinese military and with the CCP. And right now that they'll be using this type of viral gain of function research will be used against us in some type of a military setting. Maybe they'll use it to attack our food sources. Maybe they'll use it to attack our soldiers. I don't know. But this is way more scary than a nuclear bomb is in so many ways. So we need to stop this type of research until we can get our arms around it and control it, but certainly not continue to fund research in China where they hide and obfuscate from us any information that may be critical, that may be life-threatening to Americans.
Senator Roger Marshall, really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you. Tough topics here.
With a snowstorm headed to Washington, D.C. this evening, lawmakers rushing their last order of business, that is avoiding a government shutdown. It's the third time this fiscal year Congress has kicked the can down the road on funding, and House conservatives are fuming. NTD's Melina Wisecup is at the Capitol with a live update. Melina, good to see you. If you could tell us more about some of why there's so much strong opposition to this vote tonight.
Good evening, Steve. Good to see you too. So the House just wrapped up their voting just moments ago. The Senate wrapped it up a few hours ago with 18 Republicans opposing it. Now it's off to the president's desk for his signature. Now the House vote was really eye-opening because we saw more than 100 Republicans voting against this continuing resolution. There were more Democrats voting for it than there were Republicans. This just speaks to the frustration that we've seen from House Republicans during this entire Congress about what they say is the need to cut government spending. This is what they've been pushing this entire Congress. This is actually the heart of a lot of the political discord that we've seen in the Republican House majority, and part of why House Speaker part of why former Speaker Kevin McCarthy got ousted before. So this is a very sensitive issue for Republicans right now. To speak to your point about why there is so much opposition over this particular bill, well, there are those who are always opposed to continuing resolutions because they just see it as Congress delaying their inability to budget. You have other Republicans now who are trying to push the message that they don't want to continue to fund the Department of Homeland Security without foreseeing policy changes at the border to secure the border. And then you just have those who are concerned with the sheer level of government funding. This is often the messaging you hear from members on the House Freedom Caucus, for example. They put out a statement saying that this is what surrender looks like, saying Americans did not elect a Republican majority to continue Pelosi's inflationary spending and Biden's failed policies. Congressman Chip Roy, who's a member of the Freedom Caucus himself, actually took to the House floor today to remind members exactly what they're voting on with this continuing resolution. We'll show you what he had to say, along with how his speaker, Mike Johnson, has been trying to fend off some of this Republican criticism.
We will fund a weaponized Department of Justice and FBI going after parents like Scott Smith and Mark Houck. I've got more, because that's what we're doing. We are voting to fund a federal bureaucracy that is war with the American people while we indebt our children for generations.
And this is an important thing for us because it allows us to fight for our policy changes, our policy riders in those spending bills. And it takes time to do that. And so the reason we need just a little bit more time on the calendar is to allow that process to play.
Now the real question is, like you mentioned, this is the third time they've had to pass a continuing resolution. So the question now is, like, will they actually be able to reach the goal of passing their full long-term government funding bill with this extra 3 weeks that they're giving themselves right now? The House has only passed 7 of its 12 appropriations bills. They still have 5 more to consider. The Senate still has a number to consider. They only have passed 3 of their 12 appropriations bills. And with the House Republicans really disagreeing with each other on many of these spending issues, this is a real question right now. It's unclear if they will be able to pass the rest of their appropriations bills anytime soon, especially within such a short timeline that they're giving themselves, just the next couple of weeks. As a matter of fact, the Republican leader has had to, on multiple occasions, pull bills from the floor because they could not get the Republican support needed to pass those appropriations bills. So this is a real question right now as to whether or not they can actually get this done at some point. Steve?
Well, Melina, it looks like this discussion is to be continued. NTD's Melina Wisecup with a live report from Capitol Hill. Thank you, Melina. Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.